Welcome, as I said. This webinar is a presentation of the New York State and CSEA Partnership for Education and Training. My name is Melanie Grossman, and I'm going to be your host today. The facilitator today is going to be Todd Moorman. And Todd, I'm going to introduce you in just a second, but before I do, I want to take a moment to point out a few things. I have muted everybody's phone lines to keep background noise and distractions to a minimum. So if you have any questions or comments, you can use that chat box we used before, or you can raise your electronic hand as we just did. Lastly, we're going to be performing several activities throughout today's webinar, and they may involve you clicking on your raise hand button, or it may involve you taking a poll or voting on something. So this is interactive, and we encourage you all to be involved. As I mentioned, folks, this is a webinar sponsored by the New York State and CSEA Partnership for Education and Training. And most folks just call us the partnership. Some of you may be wondering, what is the partnership? Well, for those who aren't familiar, the partnership is an organization that administers education and training programs for CSEA represented employees, and we do that through labor management cooperation. We're funded through negotiated agreements that are between New York State and the CSEA labor union. The partnership offers in-person classroom training, online learning, educational advisement services. We offer grants and tuition benefits, labor management services, and lots of other education and training programs, like today's webinar. The partnership, like I said, is a joint labor management organization, and we have a pretty specific mission. We want to promote career mobility, improve job skills, support workplace safety and health, and promote effective labor management relations. If you have any questions about this or want to learn more about the partnership, I encourage you to look at our website or give us a call directly and we'll talk to you about it. Our contact information is going to be provided again at the end of today's webinar, so don't be too concerned about writing it down now. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Now that we know about the partnership, let's start with Introduction to Critical Thinking. And I'd love to turn the presentation over to you, Todd.
All right, thank you so much, Melanie, and welcome everyone. It's great to have so many folks with us. So as Melanie said, I'm Todd Moorman, and I am self-employed. I can honestly say I've never had a better boss. My company name is Dynamic Training, and it's located in New York City. I do see we have some folks from the metropolitan area, but great to see all of you since I've done work all throughout the state with a number of government agencies. I also do a lot of work with early childhood education facilities, hospitals, nursing homes, so really a wide gamut of organizations and agencies, and have been doing programs with the partnership for quite some time, including the full day version of this program. So it's great to be able to share this information with you in the format of the webinar. So let's get started. Really, there are many reasons we want to be thinking about improving our critical thinking skills. And if we take a look at some of the research, about every 5 years, the World Economic Forum, some of you may be familiar with that, selects the top 10 skills that people need in order to be successful in the workplace. And if we look at the 2020 list, critical thinking was listed as number 2 of the skills for folks to have. So today's webinar is going to really give you an introduction to this important skill. We're going to talk about the basics of critical thinking, and we'll give you some tools that you'll be able to apply in your work. And I think you'll find as we move through the webinar that these same tools are going to help you in your personal lives as well. So as we go through the webinar today, we're going to define what critical thinking is. And I see in the chat a number of you had great comments about your sense of what the definition is. So we're already ahead of the game. That's terrific. In addition to looking at the definition, we're also going to take a look at some barriers to engaging in this type of thinking. And we'll, of course, discuss how we can overcome some of those barriers as well. And then lastly, we want to examine the critical thinking process. And it is a process, and a number of your comments seem to indicate that you have a sense of that already. So that's great. And we also want to apply this process to a work-related case study that we'll work through later in the program.
That all sounds great, Todd. I do want to mention, folks, if you are logged in just with a phone as opposed to computer and phone, we do need your name because we are unable to give you credit for attending the class if you are just calling in and not letting us know your name. So we do have a call-in user whose phone number starts 518-391, and we have a call-in user 585-698. So I would love to be able to give you both credit if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat box or hanging out at the end of today's webinar so that we can unmute you and give you credit. Thank you very much.
All right, well, let's get started. As you can see on the slide, the first thing I want to do is open up with a question. So do you think critical thinking is about expressing disapproval or negative judgments?
All right, friends, I'm going to open up a poll that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. Go ahead and take your mouse and click on option A for yes or B for no. And when you're done, please go ahead and click on that submit button. All right, I see many people have not answered yet. Make sure you're submitting it. Should see that polling. It won't let you submit it. Okay. So let's transition a little bit. Right in the chat, write a yes or a no. Why don't we do that? All right, I am seeing lots of no's.
That does seem to be the consensus, Melanie.
Yes.
I don't see any yeses. So in this case, you are all correct. That is the correct answer. So the word critical by itself, it certainly can mean expressing disapproval or negative judgments. But when we talk about critical thinking, we're really talking about a process of reaching logical conclusions based on facts. And I saw both of those words in your comments today. A couple of folks mentioned logic and a couple of folks mentioned facts. So you're right on track.
That is great.
All right, so what exactly do we think critical thinking means? If we take a look at dictionary.com, it defines it as a disciplined type of thinking that's clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. And we just heard that critical thinking is number 2 on the top 10 list of skills that workers should have in order to be successful. So why do you think that might be? Well, simply put, critical thinkers make better decisions. And they do so by getting a lot of information, getting information first, and then basing their final decisions on those facts instead of on opinions. And those skills can certainly help all of us in our jobs. Critical thinking skills, as I said before, can also improve our quality of life overall by helping us make better decisions. So the question becomes, why don't we engage in critical thinking all of the time? If we look at what the research tells us, some psychologists say the reason for that is that we're all making thousands of decisions a day, which I know certainly applies to me, and I'm sure it does to you as well. So, we don't really need to apply a formal critical thinking process to every single decision we make, or we probably wouldn't get that much done in a day. But some of our decisions, of course, are more important than others, and some have more long-lasting consequences if we don't get it right. So those are the kinds of decisions we want to be thinking about as to how we can use critical thinking techniques. So before we move on, I want to emphasize a point that often creates some confusion. Problem solving and critical thinking are not the same thing. So that's the place we want to start. So when we look at this, critical thinking can be a step in the problem solving process, but it does not really provide creative or practical solutions on its own. It's a separate skill, and it can help you in other aspects of your life, such as understanding new concepts or making decisions. So lots of words on this slide that help us think about what critical thinking is, and a couple of them we've already mentioned. It's calm, it's rational, it's explainable, it's structured, it's clear, it's logical, and it's really about taking an objective look as much as possible at a situation and focusing on those facts. On the other hand, critical thinking is not emotional, it's not generalized, and it's not biased. It's not based on opinions or assumptions, but it's rather based on facts and data. Critical thinkers try to avoid jumping to conclusions or taking information at face value. Instead, they try to go beyond the surface level and to dig deeper to better understand the situation at hand. So before we look at our next topic, let me just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions about the definition of critical thinking.
Of course, if you do, you can go ahead and raise your electronic hand or put it right in the chat box. If you have any questions at all at this juncture. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. I'll give you about 30 more seconds in case you need something in the chat box. Okay, Todd, I think we can move on.
All right, terrific. So since we have a good understanding of the definition, let's move on and talk about the barriers. Why don't we engage in critical thinking as frequently as we might want to? So there are a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is that there are natural barriers to engaging in critical thinking. So let's hear from you. I'm curious, why do you think people don't use critical thinking skills more frequently? Let's hear your ideas first.
Go ahead and type those ideas right in the chat box. Why do you think people are not apt to use critical thinking skills more often? Impulsiveness, the truth hurts, that's true. It's time consuming, lack of information, biases, impulse again, conflict, okay. People take it personally, time. Yeah, lots of great answers. People don't use their brain a lot. I'm seeing a lot of time issues, perceived biases, conflict, and impulsiveness seems to be the majority of the answers.
Those are the themes that usually come up when we ask this question, so everybody's right on track. Time is almost always at the top of the list. Certainly emotions getting in the way as well. Being impulsive, we've all made impulsive decisions, I'm sure. So everybody seems to be right on track with their ideas. Many of us just aren't comfortable with change. That's another element that you want to think about. We're used to doing things in a certain way, and for probably all of us, it's difficult to break old habits once we've gotten accustomed to doing things in a particular way. So when you think about it, the barriers that we're talking about with critical thinking really fall into two categories. There are those barriers that we have as individuals, but there are also barriers we might encounter in our environments. So those are the two categories of barriers we want to be thinking about. So it is, of course, easy to get focused on doing things a certain way, as I said, and those are kind of our individual barriers. And they cause us to stop questioning why we do things in a certain way. So that's one of the individual barriers. At other times, we might not be clear in our own minds about what an issue is, and so we develop kind of fuzzy thinking about the issue. And other times we have really strong opinions, or we have a bias about a situation, and those are very difficult to change, as we know. And all of us can be a little bit stubborn, so that gets in the way as well. So the bottom line is that it's easy to look at issues on a surface level and make quick judgments without thinking things through. And those stand in the way of good critical thinking. So why do we do those kinds of things? It's not because we're bad people. So that's the first thing to remember. We are all processing a lot of information on a daily basis. Time is an issue, as many of you noted. And so we don't really have the time always to look at things more fully. It does take a fair amount of energy and effort in order to do so. And probably most of us are feeling pretty stretched already. So all of the barriers we experience at the individual level also apply to our environments. After all, people are, of course, part of our environment as well. So for example, we may personally have the will to question things, but sometimes we might lack support from our coworkers or from our supervisors, the support needed in order to dig deeper into an issue, that is. In fact, some of the people around you may feel uncomfortable having their practices questioned. I'm sure you've all heard the old adage, we've always done it that way. That belief can certainly be a challenge when it comes to critical thinking. There might also be time pressures at work. I'm sure every single person on the webinar today experiences those, and that makes it hard to question things and to make change. And most of our agencies have significant workloads, and the resources to get those workloads accomplished are often limited. So we need to ask the question, what will the cost in time or money be in the long run if we don't think things through? So after all, something that worked in the past, it's not necessarily going to work forever, and things do change. So does anyone have any questions about common barriers to critical thinking before we move on to our next topic?
As a reminder, you can raise that electronic hand or throw it right in the chat box at any point. Todd, I'm not seeing any raised hands.
All right, terrific. Well, then I
Or
guess
questions.
we'll move on. All right, so now that we've taken a look at those barriers, I want you to consider another question. And that question is, how are we going to overcome those barriers? What are some ways we can overcome them?
Go ahead and throw those ways to overcome them right in the chat box.
Open mind, excellent. Hard to do, but important to do. Conversation, sure. Conversation with others can help us get in touch with our biases, for example.
Asking for support, I love that. Very few of us ever ask for help.
Yeah. Just asking questions. I like that one too, Samantha. That's great. Sometimes we don't spend enough time asking questions. We make assumptions. Slowing down. Hard to do when there's a lot on your plate, right, Angela? But important. Staying positive, great. Sure, negativity can certainly color our perception of things. It's a great list, Melanie.
Sure is. We've got a very critically thinking forward group here today.
Always think it through before acting or talking. Terrific, terrific summary. If everyone could do that, what a better place the world would be.
Absolutely.
Mindfulness, good. This is a really terrific list. Keeping emotion out of it. That's really hard to do in some cases because things provoke strong emotions sometimes. But for critical thinking, you're absolutely right, Heidi. We want to try to keep emotions out of the decision-making process. Good. This is terrific. Great idea. So when we're faced with these kinds of barriers, whether they're individual, whether they're environmental, we want to try to be prepared to answer why it's in everyone's interest to question an issue at a deeper level. And you need to be prepared for that because you can almost guarantee that you're going to run into some resistance when you try to question things. Having said that, certainly we want to remember that it's important to be respectful and polite when we ask questions. And when a person replies to your questions, you want to make sure you're listening fully to what they have to say and keeping an open mind, as you've said here. And once you overcome the barriers to critical thinking, there are questions we can ask to engage in better thinking. And we'll take a look at those now. So good questions are our friend, everybody. Good questions can help us get the information we need and check to make sure that we understand everything we think we've learned. So when we ask questions, we also get points of view that we weren't aware of before, and they help us create a space to explore and consider different options. So let's use a hypothetical situation to think about this a little bit more. In this situation, I want you to think about a situation where you are talking to a friend about an upcoming event that you really know nothing about. So what kinds of questions would you have to ask in order to find out what you need to know in order to attend the event? What kinds of things would be important to know for you to decide that you're going to attend or you'll be able to attend? Location, yeah, first and foremost, where is it, right? A couple of you have mentioning that. Time, what type of event? What is the event about? So I'm seeing the typical questions: what, where, who's going, who's hosting it, who's attending. Great. What is the content? What's the topic? Do you need to bring anything? Oh, I like that. You're invited to my house, Angela. Do I need to bring anything? Good. How to dress? Excellent. If there are gifts involved, cost? Good. Those are all terrific questions. So, what happens if we forget to ask one of these questions about the event? We may end up with not all the information we need to attend. I'm thinking of situations where I've forgotten to ask about attire and I've showed up either overdressed or underdressed. So getting that information helps us, make sure that we are acting appropriately. So you did a great job, everybody. Terrific list. So many of the things that I've heard all of you say boil down to what we call these 6 questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And these same questions you will use to gather that kind of information. A number of the things that folks listed really captured those key questions. Sometimes when we're in a hurry, we may ask some of these questions, but we don't ask the other ones, as we've said. And that's why it's a good idea to stop and check and see if we've asked everything we should have. And if we've missed a question, we might have a gap in our understanding. So, for example, we might have asked things like, who can provide me with more information? Who are the key players? What other information do I have or do I need? What other factors should I consider? Where can I get more information? When did it take place, or when is it going to take place? Why do I think this is the case? And how do I approach this? So these 6 key questions are really important to ask. And I'm sure we all do our best to ask good questions at our jobs, but certainly it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day work that we're all doing and to not take the time to ask these questions more fully. So for example, maybe we get a phone call from a customer and we end up transferring it to the wrong person. If we had perhaps taken a little bit more time to ask a few questions, we might have understood the customer's needs better and sent the person to the correct place. Try to think about other situations at work where this might be helpful and start asking more questions. And speaking of that, are there any questions anybody has about overcoming barriers before we move on to talk about the critical thinking process?
Friendly reminder, you can do that by raising your electronic hand or typing it right in the chat box. We are happy to pause at any time to answer your questions. And they can be a who, what, where, when, how type question if necessary. I'm not seeing any questions. I think we can move on.
All right, terrific. That just means we're doing a terrific job, Melanie.
Yes, it does.
All right, so as I said previously, the goal of critical thinking is to apply this logical process when we're considering an issue before we make a decision. So that's what we want to take a look at. And there are 5 steps that are part of this process, as you can see listed on the slide. So number 1, we want to define the issue. Number 2, we want to clarify understanding. And number 3, we'll evaluate alternatives. 4, we're going to consider the impact of each of those alternatives. And then 5, we'll draw conclusions. So we're going to go through each of these steps in more detail. And later we'll use the work-related case study that you should have as part of your handouts. And as we explore each of these steps, you're probably going to find that you do some of these things to some extent now, when you're trying to make a decision. However, what we hope you'll realize is the more you use all of these steps, the better your critical thinking skills will be.
Folks, as an aside, do not worry if you haven't printed those handouts yet. You can do so after the webinar if you'd like. We're going to discuss the case study in its entirety when we come to it, so you don't have to have it printed. And just as an FYI, if you're not sure where those printed handouts would come from, they would have been attached to your email that you got about a week or two ago that told you you had been admitted to the class and you were enrolled. So go ahead and look for that after the webinar if you don't know where it is.
All right, so the first step in the critical thinking process, as we said, is to define the issue. So this is about understanding the situation and the goal. So you want to consider asking yourself, do I know what's happening here? You need to be able to describe the issue and list the important facts before you can move forward. And if the answer to that question is no, well, then you might need to ask questions or dig deeper into the situation or the subject. When you have a particular issue in mind, you can question key elements and the evidence that defines the issue. So in this step, you're also going to identify the goal that you're hoping to accomplish. So let's use another hypothetical example here to see how this first step plays itself out. So on this slide, we have Rena, who commutes to work by bus at the present time, and she's thinking about getting a car to have greater flexibility. Based on that description, do you feel like you understand her situation?
I'm going to open that poll for you. I'm hoping it works this time. All right, it is working this time. That's great. So that poll panel has opened on the right-hand side of the screen. Take your mouse and click on option A for yes or B for no. And when you're done, make sure you click on that submit button so that your vote is locked in. I do see we've got 8 people that have not clicked that submit button but have voted. So take a look and make sure you have clicked that. Okay. Got 7 people now that haven't clicked it yet. 5 people. We do have 7 people that have not taken the poll yet, so I would love for everybody to try and submit their answer. All right. Okay, we got a few more. I know there are some folks logged in on their phones, so perhaps you're unable to do that. All right, do we have 2 more people that did not click submit? Go ahead and click submit. Wonderful. Okay, so let's see where everybody ended up. Oh, wow. Okay, we've got about half the people saying yes, and we've got about 25% of the people are saying no.
Interesting. All righty.
Yeah.
So difference of opinion here. So I think in terms of really understanding the issue, I think the better answer is no. So we don't really know a lot, actually, based on the description I provided. We don't know if Rena has the money to buy a car. We don't know if she has the money to pay for insurance. We don't know if she needs a car for some other reason, maybe a family issue or changing shifts to a time when the bus doesn't run. We don't know any of those things, and a host of other things as well. So based on that, I would say the better answer is no. So let's take a look at the second step. The second step in the critical thinking process is to clarify understanding. So during this step, we want to be trying to look at the issue from all sides, and it kind of gets at some of the things that we just realized that we didn't know about Rena's situation. You want to make sure you have enough information and the right information, and you want to make sure the information you have constitutes facts versus opinions. It can be very easy in these situations to take the opinion of another person or another source without looking too deeply at it. You might not feel comfortable questioning people who seem like experts, but critical thinking doesn't mean that you're challenging someone's work or telling them that they're wrong. It's just a way for us to get a better understanding of the situation. So some questions that you should be asking at this stage include, what information do I have at my disposal right now? Whose viewpoints do I need to consider? What additional information do I need? And so if we return to the example of Rena, who's thinking about getting that car, what kinds of questions might you ask her to clarify your understanding of her situation? I cued you a little bit with some of my follow-up there, but let's hear what you have to say.
Let's share those with each other in the chat box. Go ahead, type some clarifying questions you could ask Rena.
Does she have a driver's license?
Yeah, I mean, that's solid step one, I think. Yeah.
One would hope.
Yeah.
You never know. Does she have good credit? Sure, that'll influence her ability to purchase a car. What kind of car do you have in mind? I'm voting on a BMW, Rena. What's the price range? What can she afford? Sure. Does she have savings available? How far is the job from her home? These are great questions. Does she have a place to park? Spoken like a New Yorker.
Yeah, right. Budget, parking.
Does she have a good
You afford
driving
the
record?
gas. Yeah, it's not just the.
Affording gas, great, good. Terrific list. This is really a great list. So as hopefully everybody's seeing, even though we thought originally that we had defined the issue, there really was a lot more to it than we first thought. And by asking many of these questions, and I see even more coming in that are great, whether she's nervous about driving, can she afford the maintenance, all kinds of considerations listed here. And by asking these kinds of clarifying questions, that we really end up with a much better understanding of her situation that will allow us to reach a better conclusion, or in this case, to make a recommendation as to how she should proceed.
Again, lots of critical thinking on behalf of the participants here.
Yeah, very good. They're going to teach the next session for you, Melanie. All right, so the third step is to evaluate alternatives. So in other words, what options might exist? And so this is when you begin to make what-if statements. And the what-ifs allow you to think about different alternatives and to consider each of them critically. You want to be careful not to dismiss ideas or prejudge them at this stage. Oftentimes we think right away it can't be done or it won't work. You want to try to avoid that kind of thinking and remain open-minded about those options and try not to shut down opposing views. You also want to be careful not to select only data or options that support your particular preference in the situation. If you don't look at all the options, that creates a barrier in the critical thinking process. So let's go back to Rena. You've listed great clarifying questions, and we know she's thinking about getting a car so that she can accept a job offer that is farther from home. The job pays more money, but it's not on the bus route. She doesn't have the money to insure or maintain the car with the income from her current job, but probably would after she gets the new job. So I want you to think about what options Rena could try that would help her get the better paying job.
Go ahead and type those ideas in the chat box. Let's work together to see. Carpooling. That's funny. That's top on a lot of people's list coming through.
Uber. Okay.
Yep. Public transport. Ride your bike. Hitch a ride. Oh, interesting. From another perspective, Catherine says, is the new job guaranteed?
Yeah.
Hitchhike.
Good thinking outside the box.
I
Yeah.
like it. Maybe not the safest, but I like it. All right, lots of great ideas here. Bus, carpool.
Telecommuting. Okay.
Telecommuting is the best.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take the train or subway. Lots of wonderful ideas.
Yeah, these are all right on point. Terrific ideas, everybody. All right, so we'll move on to the fourth step in the process. So this step, everybody, is to consider the impact of the options. And so what we do here is we test the alternatives by thinking through what would happen if a particular option was put into place. So similarly, we want to be asking questions here. And some of the questions we would ask include, how would a particular option help? Who would it help? Where would I get it? What risks might be involved? How much would it cost? So in other words, you want to consider the pros and cons of each of the alternatives that you had looked at. So in Rena's case, she might consider the pros and cons of buying a car or moving closer to the new job. And our last step in the critical thinking process is to draw conclusions. And at this step, we're making a logical choice after we've carefully looked at the pros and cons of each of the options we had considered. So a logical conclusion is a natural outcome if you've worked through the critical thinking process fully. Before you reach your conclusion, you want to make sure you've really examined all of the evidence at your disposal and that you've applied a logical and reasoned process to your thinking. It's important to remember at this point that you're not selecting a solution, but you're applying the critical thinking process in order to reach a conclusion. And sometimes conclusions can come in the form of a recommendation. So for example, once Rena has created her pros and cons chart, she might realize that buying the car has more pros than cons. So now that we've taken a look at what the critical thinking process is all about, let's apply it to a work-related example. So I had mentioned earlier that we had a work-related case study for you. So let's take a look at this and walk through it together. So in the case study, we have Dimitri, who works at a facility that provides inpatient and outpatient mental health services. So recently, Dimitri's manager asked that a system be developed and maintained for tracking volunteers. And facility supervisors right now complete forms for each volunteer showing their start date and their expected separation or leave date. Volunteers are at that point listed in the division's staffing plan report. So each month, Dimitri will need to identify which volunteers are expected to leave in the next 30 days. It's not uncommon to see upwards of 15 volunteers leave the facility in any given month. Dimitri will also need to find a way to confirm if volunteer appointments will be extended. If the volunteers leave, Dimitri will need to remove them from the system. So as we move forward, we're going to see how each step of the critical thinking process can be applied to Dimitri's situation. So remember, our first step in the critical thinking process is to define the issue. So think about Dimitri's situation. How would you define the issue? Would it be A, Dimitri needs to remove volunteers from the system? B, Dimitri needs to develop a system to track volunteers? C, Dimitri needs to extend volunteer appointments? Or D, Dimitri needs to make a report every 30 days? So
I'd like you to notice I've opened that polling panel once again on the right-hand side of your screen. From the looks of it, it seems to be working for everyone.
Looks good on my screen, Melanie.
Yeah, that's great. So it looks like thus far everybody is in agreement. Which is very interesting. We'll give you another minute or so to read the answers. Okay, we do have a few people varying now, so this keeps it interesting. I like it. We have a large majority voting for one specific answer. Very interesting. All right, we've got about 10 more people that need to lock their votes in. Make sure you're clicking submit. I think the same 2 people did not click submit this time. I want to make sure you're counted, friends. All righty. Perfect. Everybody submitted. So it looks to me like 69% of people said B.
All right, so the majority wins. They are correct. B is the correct answer. Dimitri does need to develop that system for tracking volunteers. And the system that gets developed will allow Dimitri to do the other things that are listed as choices here, like making the report, extending appointments, and removing volunteers from the system. All right, so next, let's take a look at step number 2, which is clarifying understanding. So for example, whose perspective or point of view should Dimitri consider before making a decision?
Go ahead and type that right in the chat box. Who should he consider? Not seeing any answers yet. The volunteers,
Great.
okay.
Yeah. Supervisor and staff, good. Facility needs, okay, so it's maybe other folks in the facility. Everybody who's involved, sure. Good. All right. Looks like we're right on point here. So Dimitri certainly needs to consider those perspectives. Everybody's got the right idea. Also would want to consider the manager's perspective. Supervisors, as a number of you have listed, are important as well, since they're providing the volunteer forms and would be able to confirm if people are leaving or staying. It would also help if Dimitri could get the perspective of whomever maintains that division's staffing plan report. If there are issues regarding the timeliness of communication from the volunteers, that information would be helpful to have. We could get the perspectives of those volunteers for that type of insight. So I know almost everybody listed volunteers. So great job, everyone. Right on point. All right, so the next step, if you remember, is to evaluate alternatives. Which options do we think Dimitri should consider? Can you
Go ahead
think
and share those. Let's put those right in the chat box again.
of any ways
should he consider?
to develop a tracking system?
Excel report, extending appointments. Who would want to come back? Okay. Access report. Which appointments would be affected? Excel, Outlook. Interesting. All right, lots of different options here. I assume ask the volunteers when they're available, is what Ashley's saying. Same thing for Jeanette. That's a great answers, Todd.
I agree. So Dimitri might want to think about the types of tracking systems that are already accessible within the agency, or perhaps other systems that may exist that could be developed. For instance, if Dimitri has Microsoft Office, a tracking system could be developed using Excel or Access. I see a few folks mentioned Access. Dimitri could then create a monthly report and sort it by expected separation date. Outlook could also be used to send or receive information from the supervisors. Dimitri could create fillable forms for the supervisors to send volunteer information, and could also find out if supervisors are able to scan the forms to email. Dimitri could also find out how the personnel office tracks employees to see if volunteers could be added to that system. Or Dimitri might contact the IT help desk to see if there are other software options. Dimitri might even check to see if there are free tracking systems available on the internet that might accomplish the job. Lastly, Dimitri could even consider something as simple as index cards. Remember at this step, we're not rejecting ideas or prejudging those ideas. We're just generating the ideas. So going back to the case, some of the options we identified overall are listed on the slide here. Index cards, free software through the internet, contacting the IT help desk, using Microsoft Office, or using an existing personnel system. So what do you think might be the pros and cons associated with these alternatives?
I would love to hear what everybody has to say. Let's use that chat box again. Let's list some pros and cons. Interesting. Index cards can be lost easily. Security of them.
Index cards.
Index cards make my brain hurt. Free software is not reliable all the time. Hard to keep track of. It's interesting. Everybody seems to kind of teeter more towards the electronic version as opposed to a handwritten at this point. I think 10 years ago, people would have felt very differently. My, how things have changed.
And paid software at that, Melanie, it looks like.
Yeah.
Definitely a difference between paid software and free software. My mother always used to say, you get what you pay for.
For sure.
Great list. Office has lots of advantages, Angela says. Good. All right. Well, these are terrific thoughts. Everybody's on point once again. Valid considerations for sure. Some of these options, of course, are probably more practical than others based on how easy they are to access, what their cost might be, how quickly the goal might be achieved, and also what the learning curve for users might be. So if we look at each of these individually, index cards, pros, they're inexpensive, could be done quickly. Cons, a couple of you said they could get misplaced, they could get lost. It's a manual process that might not be very efficient. Free software, pros, there might be some good and free downloadable options. The cons, a couple of you mentioned the ads, which I agree with. Free software might also require ITS approval to download. They might not approve particular software because of security concerns. It might take longer to implement, and there could be a learning curve with that software. In terms of the IT help desk, pros, there could be other software that would be good for this purpose. Cons, could take longer to implement. There might be additional costs, or again, there could be a learning curve. Microsoft Office, pros, everybody already has access to it. That's a big one. It's quick to accomplish, partly because of that. There's no additional cost. The cons, it may be a duplication of the existing personnel system. We don't know. And then lastly, the personnel system. The pros here might be, we may be able to use some existing system and reduce duplication. The cons, the system data might be restricted to HR folks and might require transferring the task to HR, and it may be more complex than what we really need to accomplish with the need here. So given what we know, I want you to think about what recommendation you would make to implement a system to track volunteers. A, index cards, B, free software, C, IT help desk, D, Microsoft Office, or E, personnel system?
Got a lot of people voting in the chat. I
Yeah,
am
that
gonna,
works perfectly.
yeah, we can use that. I did open the poll on the right-hand side of the screen if anyone wants to utilize that.
You
Um,
can go twice if you want. Change your
I
mind.
know, I know. A, B, C, D, or E, whichever one you think is the best, and make sure you click submit so that you're counted. All right. We have all but one in agreement. Very interesting.
All
Very,
right.
very interesting. All right. Got 3 people that need to click submit. Got 2 people that need to click submit. 1 person, no people. All right. Let's see how we did, friends. We had 80% of the people say D, Microsoft Office.
All right. So I'm wondering if the one person for personnel system is from HR.
Very likely. Yeah.
So Microsoft Office is probably the best answer based on the information at our disposal. And it's certainly not to say that, personnel system or any of the other options for that matter aren't possible. However, given the information we have, Microsoft Office is probably the best choice. The information Dimitri needs to track isn't that complicated in Office. Seems like a practical recommendation based on our access to the software, its ability to be implemented quickly, doesn't have any additional cost, and it has the possibility of a shorter learning curve since most folks are already competent with it. So good work, everybody. Great work. All right, so let's do a quick review. Today we've spent some time defining critical thinking, and then we discussed barriers and we identified critical thinking questions to help us overcome those barriers. And after that, we covered the steps in the critical thinking process and then applied that process to a work situation. Your work is not done yet, everyone. However, we want you to think of ways that you might be able to use these skills in your own workplace. So think of a situation where you can apply the critical thinking steps right now. These steps work in a variety of workplace situations, whether your role is to provide administrative support, perhaps you work in an institutional setting, or you perform operations and maintenance work. In all of these settings, it's appropriate. It does take some practice, but you've had some practice here, and we've provided you with a handout as well about the critical thinking steps that will help you remember how to utilize it. I should mention that Partnership also offers a full day course entitled Critical Thinking. I've had the pleasure of teaching that course previously. And if you're interested in learning more about the topic, you might want to review the Skills for Success catalog on the Partnership's website, where you can get more information about that course and a number of other courses as well.
That is absolutely true, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But before we do, I want to give a big time thank you to Todd. This was a fantastic webinar.